I wasn't in a good place that spring, and that's the plainest way I knew to start it. I was 56 years old, built for long days under dead trucks and stubborn engines, and I had taken my first real leave in 31 years because I couldn't keep my hands steady on a wrench anymore. People at the shop said I needed rest. The pastor said I needed community. My sister said I needed to stop pretending grief was a problem I could solve with a socket set and black coffee. I told all of them I was moving back to the mountain place for fresh air, better sleep, and room for Gus to roam. That was the story. The truth was, I needed a place where nobody could hear me come apart. The homestead had belonged to Lisa's people since before paved roads reached that ridge. Her grandfather had logged cedar and planted apples by hand. Her mother kept bees there until her knees gave out. By the time it came to us, the land wasn't grand, just honest. 11 acres of sloped ground, a weathered one-story house, a red shed with a roof that always leaked over the left corner, and a fenced kitchen garden that had fed 4 generations through hard years and easy ones. Lisa loved that garden the way some folks love a hymn. She knew what each bed wanted, and when the soil needed turning by smell alone. She could stand at the gate with her hands on her hips and tell you what was wrong from 20 feet away. I used to tease her that plants only listened because they were scared of disappointing her. After she died, I stopped going near it. I'm not proud of that. It's just true. For a while, I told myself it was winter, then mud season, then work was too busy, then my back was acting up. What I didn't say out loud was that tending those beds felt like erasing her handwriting, one line at a time. I could still see where she'd laid out the marigolds in ragged, cheerful borders, where she left space for beans to climb twine, where she insisted on basil even when I said nobody needed that much basil. Letting it go felt wrong. Touching it felt worse. So I did nothing, which is a kind of choice that makes every other choice harder. By the time I moved back in, bindweed had climbed half the fence. Thistle stood shoulder-high in spots. Something thick and mean had wrapped the lower tomato frames so tight they looked welded. I started calling it the green choke in my head, because that's what it did. It choked stems, choked paths, choked any thought of starting over. Most mornings I stood on the porch with a mug gone cold, looking at that fence while fog lay low between the cedar rows. And I'd think, sell it. Then I'd think, you can't sell what she loved. Then I'd think nothing useful at all. Sleep had gone bad on me 2 years earlier and never really came back. I could doze in a chair, maybe 90 minutes at a stretch. But real sleep, the kind where your bones soften and your mind quits talking, stayed out of reach. I woke at 1:30, 3:10, 4:40 every night, like I had an appointment with the dark. The house made its old house sounds. A tick in the stovepipe, a board settling in the hallway, wind brushing the north wall. Gus would lift his head from his blanket by the wood stove, check that I was still there, then huff and settle again. He was a blue Gila mix with one torn ear and cloudy eyes, older than he acted in daylight and older than he admitted at night. We understood each other better than most people did. Cal called 3 times a week that first month. I knew because his name lit up my phone until it quit. I watched it ring from the kitchen table and didn't answer. There's no noble reason for that either. I told myself I didn't want to burden him. I told myself he had his own family and his own job and didn't need to hear his father breathing into a receiver with nothing sensible to say. Underneath all that was the simple fact that hearing my son's voice made me miss his mother so sharply, I felt it in my teeth. Avoiding him was cowardly. I knew it while I was doing it. Knowing didn't make me pick up. He left messages anyway, steady and patient, like he was knocking on a locked door without trying to break it down. "Hey Dad, just checking in. No rush." Then, a few days later, Got your mail forwarded to me by accident. I'll bring it up if you want. Then, after another week, Eli lost his first tooth and says the tooth fairy underpaid him. Thought you'd appreciate that. That one sat in my voicemail for 10 days before I listened to it a second time. My grandson's name in my son's voice felt like standing in sunlight you didn't deserve. The mountain had its own tempo, and it didn't care about mine. Dawn came pale and cold over the east ridge. By 9, the mist would lift in strips and hang in the firs. Afternoons smelled of damp earth, split cedar, and old iron warming in the shed. Evenings dropped fast into blue shade, and the coyotes called from farther down the draw, thin and conversational. I fixed little things because little things were manageable. I rehung the pantry door so it closed square. I replaced 2 cracked outlet covers. I rebuilt the porch step that had gone soft at the corner. I sharpened shovels and lined up jars of nails by size. I did work that stayed still when I was done, work that didn't ask me how I was holding up. The garden kept asking. On dry days, I'd walk down to the fence and stand at the gate with my hands in my jacket pockets, looking through rusted wire at what used to be rows. The old bean poles had fallen and lay crossed like pickup sticks. A rabbit trail cut under the south side. Lisa's hand-painted row markers, beets, snaps, dill, had faded to pale ghosts of letters. There was one corner near the shed where marigolds still came up stubbornly from old seed, small and bright and out of place, like someone had dropped scraps of sun in the weeds. That corner hurt to look at. It also kept me from turning away. One afternoon near the end of March, my neighbour Warren eased his truck up the drive without fanfare and brought me a box of chicks he didn't need and I couldn't take. He knew that before he knocked. Warren had lived on the next ridge over for 40 years, talked in short sentences, and never pushed where a man was thin-skinned. We stood by his tailgate while Gus sniffed his boots. "You settling in?" he asked. "Depends what you call settling." He nodded once like that answered enough. "You going to work that garden?" I looked toward the fence. "Not yet." "Ground don't wait," he said. "Neither does rust. I can only fight one thing at a time." A corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "You always did pick machinery over vegetables. Machinery doesn't die if you miss a watering." He let that sit between us for a moment, then passed me a paper sack. Inside was a quart jar of honey, dark and cloudy from his last good harvest. "For your throat," he said. "You sound tired." When he drove off, I stood there with that jar in my hand and felt, for a brief second, how close kindness can come to breaking a man open. By the first week of April, I had a routine that looked healthy from the outside and hollow from the inside. Up before dawn, coffee, feed Gus, check the shed roof patch after rain, sweep the porch, ignore the phone, circle the garden, tell myself maybe tomorrow. I said grace over canned soup because Lisa used to say, gratitude counted even when supper came from a shelf. Some nights I read 3 pages of the same manual and retained none of it. Some nights I sat at the kitchen table with the house lights off, listening to the refrigerator hum and wondering whether grief was supposed to get quieter or if this was as quiet as it got. I went into our bedroom only when I had to. Her side stayed made because I could not make myself disturb it. Her field jacket still hung on the back of the door, pockets full of twine and folded seed packets and a pen with no cap. I'd stand there with laundry in my hands and find myself studying those pockets like they might contain instructions. Once I put my hand in and pulled out her gardening gloves, stiff with dried mud at the fingertips. I sat on the edge of the bed with those gloves in my lap for maybe an hour, not crying, not praying, not doing anything useful at all. There are days a man can trace the exact point where he started to return to himself, and there are days that only make sense in hindsight. At the time, they just felt long. I remember one Tuesday in particular because rain had passed overnight, and the morning opened clear, with low clouds still trapped in the drawer and sunlight catching in the wet cedar bark. Gus finished breakfast and went to the porch rail, ears up, not tense, just attentive. I poured coffee and joined him, and we both looked at the garden fence without speaking, like two old workers clocking in for a shift we didn't want, but understood. The green choke looked thicker after rain, leaves slick and fat and satisfied with themselves. Water beaded on strands that crossed the gate like tied wire. I set my mug down on the rail and rubbed my face hard enough to wake up. If I was going to stay on that mountain, I had to do more than watch things fail politely. I said that out loud to nobody because hearing words sometimes made them real. Today, I told the yard, and it sounded like a lie. Still, I fetched loppers from the shed. I found my old kneeling pad under a stack of feed sacks. I walked to the gate and unhooked the latch. Mud pulled at my boots as I stepped into the first row, and the smell came up rich and alive, despite all that neglect. Rot and rain and green growth. Not pleasant exactly. Honest. I cut a single length of bindweed and tossed it aside. Then another. Then 6 more, clumsy and angry and out of rhythm. My shoulders burned fast. My lower back warned me in that clear, cold way it has. I lasted 20 minutes before I had to stand and stretch, breathing through my teeth. It wasn't much. It was less than much. But there was a patch of soil by my left boot where the weeds were gone, and the dark earth showed through. And in that small, cleared shape, I could suddenly picture Lisa kneeling there in her old straw hat, talking to seedlings like they were shy children. I rested both hands on the fence post and let that image stay without pushing it away. Wind moved through the cedars in a low hush. Somewhere down the slope, a woodpecker worked a dead snag in steady taps. Gus lay in the grass outside the gate, chin on paws, watching me as if this was exactly where he expected me to be. I went back in for lunch, with mud on my knees and dirt under my nails, and for the first time in months I didn't feel like I was waiting for a life that had already ended. I felt tired, sore, uncertain, but pointed in a direction. That evening, as light thinned over the ridge, I set Lisa's gloves on the kitchen counter where I could see them and picked up my phone. Cal's name sat at the top of recent calls, same as it had for weeks. I opened it, closed it, opened it again. My thumb hovered over the green button long enough for the screen to dim and go black. I listened to his last voicemail instead, the one about Eli and the tooth fairy, then played it a second time. After that, I opened a new text and wrote, "No, I'm not okay, but I'm here. Worked in the garden today." I stared at those words until they blurred, then saved the draft and set the phone face down by the sink without sending it. The house still felt too quiet, but not quite as airless as before. I washed my cup, checked the door locks out of habit, set an alarm I didn't need, and lay down in a bed that still held too much memory to be easy. Sleep didn't come quick. It almost never did. But when it came, close to dawn, it came without a fight. I woke while the room was still blue, that narrow hour when edges are soft, and your mind hasn't remembered all its usual weight yet. For about 5 seconds I lay there listening to rain drip from the eaves and thought I'd slept like a regular person. Then I looked at the clock and saw it was 4:18, and the old pattern stood up and introduced itself again. Gus thumped his tail once from the doorway, like he was checking attendance. I pulled on jeans, found my socks by touch, and went to the kitchen in the dark without turning on the overhead, just the stove light and the small lamp by the sink. Coffee sounded louder than it should have in that quiet house. I leaned both palms on the counter while it brewed and watched my breath cloud faint at the window glass. The garden sat downhill in a grey blur beyond the porch, fence posts barely visible between drifting strips of mist. My lower back still held yesterday's complaint, not sharp, just stiff and argumentative. I told it we were on speaking terms, not friends. That got me a private half laugh, the first one in a while, and even that felt unfamiliar, like hearing my own voice on someone else's radio. By sunrise, the rain had thinned to occasional drops from cedar tips, and the mountain had that rinsed smell it gets after a night storm, wet bark and turned soil and cold rock waking up. I carried my mug to the porch and sat on the top step because the chair made me feel older than I was. Gus settled against my shin, warm and solid. I watched the fog lift in slow folds across the lower field and tried not to think ahead farther than one task. Open gate, cut vines. Stack what I cut. Breathe. Repeat. It was small work. Small work was what I had. When I finally went down to the fence, mud took my boots with that sucking sound that always reminded me of pulling old gaskets. The latch stuck, then gave. Inside, the rows were still mostly swallowed, but yesterday's little patch of open soil sat there waiting, dark and damp, and almost black against all that tangle. I knelt on the pad and started at the nearest thistle crown, rocking it loose slow so the taproot came whole. The rhythm came and went. Sometimes I'd get 15 clean pulls in a row. Sometimes I'd snap stems and mutter at myself like a man arguing with a radio that had already lost signal. Halfway through the first bed, I had to stand and walk a circle to ease the tight pull along my spine. I stood with my hands on my hips and looked toward the house, then toward the trees, then back at the ground as if it might offer instructions. The place was quiet in a way I couldn't name right then. No traffic, of course, no people, just wind moving high and a few sparrows in the hedge. Not empty, just patient. I took another swallow of now cool coffee and went back down on one knee because the only way through a row was through the row. Around mid-morning, the sun pushed through hard enough to warm the back of my jacket. Sweat ran down between my shoulder blades. Dirt worked under my nails and into the small cuts across my knuckles. I found an old row marker buried under vine. Snaps, faded to almost nothing, and rubbed it clean on my sleeve before setting it on the fence rail. That little piece of painted wood hit me harder than it should have. I could hear Lisa saying, clear as if she stood 2 steps away, "If you label it, you'll remember it." I sat back on my heels and swallowed until the sting in my throat settled. I told myself, keep moving, Roy. Don't turn this into a shrine. But grief doesn't follow work orders. It came in waves. One minute I was cutting bindweed. Next minute, I was staring at the gatepost where she used to hang her hat and wondering what a man is supposed to do with all the ordinary habits love leaves behind. The answer, if there was one, didn't arrive in words. It arrived as motion. Pull. Shake dirt loose. Toss. Pull again. By noon, I had maybe 8 square feet reclaimed and a pile of weeds the size of a doghouse. It looked like failure from a distance and progress up close. I ate lunch standing at the sink, leftover beans and toast, then went back out because staying in felt worse. Clouds had broken by then, and the afternoon light turned everything honest. No soft edges left to hide in. The green choke looked meaner in clear sun, stems braided thick around the tomato frames, tendrils hooking any upright thing they could reach. I worked until my forearms trembled. At one point, I sat down right in the path, elbows on knees, and looked at my hands. Grease lines from years of shop work still lived in the creases no matter how much I scrubbed. New dirt sat over old stain. That felt about right. "Okay," I said out loud, to the rouse, to Lisa, to nobody I could point to. "I'm trying." Gus lifted his head from the grass and gave me a look that said I might be the only man on that ridge having formal negotiations with vegetables. It would have been funny if it wasn't so true. I drank from the hose, rinsed my face, and did one more pass down the centre bed before quitting at dusk. The sky went from pale silver to apricot behind the fir line, and cold settled quick once the sun dropped. I closed the gate, hung the loppers in the shed, and stood there a minute with my hand on the doorframe, breathing like I'd carried a transmission uphill. That evening I played Cal's latest voicemail again while I heated soup, even though we'd had that long call recently. After supper, I opened the draft text I hadn't sent and added 3 words. Did a little more. I still didn't hit send. Cowardice doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's just a thumb hovering over a button while your chest tightens for reasons you can't explain. I set the phone down and went to bed earlier than usual. Saw enough that sleep took me faster. By the second week of April, days were starting to lengthen, but nights still held a bite to them, and the old house gave it back through every wall. I woke before first light again, stiff and heavy, but not hollow. That was new enough, I noticed. Gus was already up, standing at the back door with his ears angled forward. Not alert the way he got with coyotes, more like attentive, listening for someone expected. I pulled on boots without socks, shrugged into my canvas jacket and stepped onto the porch with my mug steaming in both hands. The air sat cool against my face. Mist moved low over the garden, thicker than yesterday, and for a long minute I couldn't see the ground inside the fence at all. Then I noticed the birds, or rather, I noticed the lack of morning argument from them. Usually dawn came with sparrows fussing in the hedge and jays carrying on from the cedar tops like they had opinions about everything. That morning, there was almost none of it. A chickadee called once near the shed, then quiet again. The stillness wasn't bad. It wasn't threatening. It felt deliberate, like the mountain itself was holding its breath for one beat longer than usual. Gus didn't bark. He stepped down the porch stairs and walked toward the garden at an easy pace, tail level, nose lifting now and then. I followed him through wet grass, coffee forgotten on the rail. At the gate, he stopped and sat. Just sat, looking at the opening as if waiting for me to catch up with what he already knew. My first thought was deer. My second thought was Warren playing some practical joke that would end with me chasing him with a hoe. Then the mist thinned, and I saw the ground outside the gate. There were footprints in the loam. Bare footprints. Human shape, mostly, heel and arch and 5 clear toes, but wider than my outspread hand and longer than my forearm from wrist to elbow. They came from the cedar line in a straight line to the gate and stopped right there at the threshold. No prints inside. None. The next set turned back toward the trees, deep enough in the wet dirt that water had pooled in the edges. I stood there long enough for coffee to cool in my mouth without swallowing. My mind did what minds do. Bare hind feet over front tracks. Some kind of carved fake pressed into mud. I needed more sleep. I needed less coffee. I needed to quit turning grief into ghost stories. I crouched and put my tape measure from my pocket against one print, because numbers have always steadied me. 17 inches, heel to toe. Near 7 across the forefoot, toe spacing clear as a diagram. No claw marks, no boot tread, just skin lines faint in the mud where the arch had lifted. Gus leaned forward and sniffed once, then looked past the gate toward the beds, not uneasy, not keyed up, just interested. That was when I opened the latch and stepped inside. I expected yesterday's mess, maybe worse from the rain. Instead, the whole left bed had been weeded in clean bands. Invasive vines pulled and laid in neat mounds at the edge of the path. Not hacked, not ripped by machine. Hand-pulled, roots shaken free and stacked as tidy as cordwood. My beans' starts, the few that had survived neglect, stood untouched. So did the marigold corner. Even the volunteer dill by the south post was still there, thin and feathery and alive. On top of the gate post sat 2 flat river stones I did not own, crossed into an X. Beside them lay a fresh yarrow sprig, stem unbroken. White flowers still beaded with dew. I reached out and touched the stones with one fingertip to make sure they were real and cold and ordinary. They were. I looked around the fence line, then toward the shed, then up toward the cedar rows where the prints had come from and gone back to. Nothing moved except mist and one drifting strand of spider silk catching light. "Morning," I said, because I had no other word that fit. My own voice sounded small, but steady. Gus gave a soft huff and lay down just outside the gate, chin on paws, facing the trees like a polite sentry. I walked the bed twice, checking for boot marks, tool cuts, any sign of prank or machinery. There were none. Just those great bare tracks outside the fence, stopping exactly where the latch began, and the work itself done with a care I recognized in my bones. Separate what chokes from what feeds. Leave the living roots you mean to keep. Stack the burden where it can be carried away. I should have been frightened, maybe. Instead, I felt a crack run through the hard shell I'd been wearing since the funeral, thin as a hairline in glass, but real. Someone had entered the edges of my life without breaking anything. Something large had chosen gentleness where force would have been easier. I stood in that damp morning with dirt under my nails, and my wife's garden half cleared by hands I could not explain, and for the first time in 2 years, despair loosened its grip enough for me to breathe all the way down. I stayed there with my hand on the gatepost until the chill from the wet wood worked into my fingers. Then the mechanic part of me, the part that trusted measurements over feelings, finally came back online. I went to the shed, found a tape measure, a notepad, and the old point-and-shoot camera I kept for parts diagrams. And I came back to the prints like I was logging damage on a truck nobody could identify. 17 inches, maybe a touch over on the deepest one. Toe spread wider than any boot I'd ever seen, even those novelty clown things people wore in parades. Depth, nearly 2 inches in soft loam, and the stride from one heel to the next was around 4 feet, maybe more where the ground got slick. I wrote every number down and drew a rough sketch. It felt ridiculous and necessary at the same time. Inside the fence, I knelt by one of the weed piles and studied the roots. They were intact, long white runners shaken clean, not chopped. Whoever did it had taken time. I moved to the marigold corner and found 3 tiny seedlings I hadn't noticed the day before. Each one left untouched in a narrow ring where the bindweed had been lifted away by hand. Not luck, intention. I told myself this couldn't be real. Then I said it again in my head with different words, hoping one version would stick. It didn't. By the time the sun cleared the east ridge, I had walked the fence line twice, checked for signs of a ladder, checked for scuffed wire where someone might have climbed, checked for tracks from any direction except cedar. Nothing. The only clear trail in and out belonged to those bare feet, and they stopped where the gate started, as if a line had been honored. I picked up the crossed stones and yarrow, then set them back exactly where I'd found them. My chest felt tight, but not with fear. More like I had stepped into a conversation already in progress and didn't know the language yet. Gus got up, stretched slow, and wandered to the tree line where the path dropped toward the creek. He stood there with his tail moving once every few seconds, not wagging hard, just steady. Waiting, maybe. Listening. When I called him, he came right back and leaned against my leg. I worked the garden until noon because standing still made my thoughts too loud. Each time I straightened my back, I caught myself glancing towards Cedar Shade. At one point, I laughed under my breath and said, "Roy, you are a grown man hiding from vegetables and taking instructions from footprints." It was the kind of sentence you'd hear and decide a person needed more sleep and less solitude. In the early afternoon, I drove down to Miller's Feed for chicken scratch and hose washers I didn't need. I wanted fluorescent lights and other people's ordinary problems for an hour. The store smelled like grain dust and rubber boots, and coffee that had been sitting on a burner since sunrise. Two old men in seed caps were arguing gently over fence staples by the front counter. Teenagers from town were loading mineral blocks in the lot. Nothing unusual. Thank God for that. Marlene at the register scanned my washers and looked at the mud on my cuffs. "Garden finally won your argument." "Looks that way," I said. "Lisa would approve." I swallowed. Yeah, she probably would. Warren came in while I was signing the receipt, nodded toward the rain gear aisle, then toward me. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Not a ghost," he waited. I kept my eyes on the pen chain. "You ever hear stories up here about help around gardens?" His face didn't change much, but he stopped reaching for the free coffee cups. "Depends who's talking and who's listening." "I found prints this morning," I said quietly. "Big ones. Bare. Came to my gate and turned back. Somebody weeded half a bed overnight." One of the old men by the seed display glanced over, not nosy, more like he'd heard his name in another room. He looked at me for a moment and said, "Some of us been helped before." Then he turned back to fence staples like that was all there was to add. Nobody laughed. Nobody asked me what I'd been drinking. Warren just slid his hand along the counter and tapped once. "You keep your head clear. You mind your manners. You don't chase what doesn't want chasing." I nodded. "That dog of yours spook?" he asked. "No, calm as Sunday." "Then stay calm too." I drove home with the washers rattling in a paper sack and that short exchange sitting warm in my chest. It didn't explain anything. It did something better. It told me I wasn't the only man who had stood in the wrong-sized shadow of a kind thing and run out of words. That night, I set up a few tests anyway, because habits die hard. I smoothed fresh mud outside the gate with a rake. I tied black twine knee-high across the opening, loose enough that any body moving through would snag it. I dusted a thin strip of flour on the gate threshold, felt foolish doing it, then did it carefully anyway. I moved a folding chair to the shed corner where I could see the fence without being obvious from the house. Gus watched all this with patient disappointment, like he'd seen me overthink simple truths before. 3 days passed in that new pattern, and each dawn repeated the same quiet contradiction. Fresh, oversized prints came out of Cedar Shade and stopped at the gate. Twine untouched. Flower unbroken at the threshold. Inside the beds, the green choke kept losing ground in widening circles. The weed piles grew into tidy mounds by the compost corner, arranged so neat they looked planned by someone who understood straight lines and completion. The marigolds perked up. Bean vines found twine again. A volunteer squash leaf, broad and ridiculous, unfolded where I would have sworn nothing viable remained. The gifts changed each morning. One day it was 2 curled cedar sprigs laid parallel on the top rail. Next day, a clean hawk feather set across a flat stone. On the third morning, 3 river pebbles in a triangle beside the latch, each one washed and pale. I handled each item like evidence and like a blessing, depending on the minute. By the second week of April, curiosity had edged grief aside for whole stretches at a time. That surprised me most, not because sorrow vanished. It didn't. It sat where it always sat, heavy and familiar. But now, between coffee and noon, I sometimes found myself planning. If that row gets cleared, I can restring beans. If the lower bed drains, I can try potatoes. If Cal comes up in fall, Eli can press garlic cloves in with both thumbs, the way Lisa taught him when he was small enough to mispronounce everything. Hope did not arrive as a trumpet blast. It arrived as a to-do list. On the fourth morning after Miller's feed, mist lay thick enough I could barely make out the fence from the shed. I took my chair anyway, a thermos lid of coffee in one hand, gloves in my pocket, and settled into shadow before first light. Gus walked with me, then lay down at my boot without fuss. The mountain woke in layers, drip from cedar boughs, one towhee call from the blackberry patch, the soft creak of the gate hinge as wind shifted. Then the birds kept singing. That detail matters because if you've lived out here long enough, you learn the difference between quiet that warns and quiet that simply waits. This was waiting. Chickadees hopped on the tomato stakes and chattered like nothing unusual stood 10 feet from them. At first I saw only motion, dark against dark, low and deliberate between the center rows. I leaned forward without meaning to. A broad shoulder moved past a post, then a forearm longer than my entire lower leg reached down into the vines. The figure was crouched, back-rounded, fur deep brown to near black, where the mist beaded on it, not matted. Clean in the way a rain-dark horse looks clean. It was enormous. 8 feet, maybe more if it stood fully upright, though in that moment it kept a half crouch to work close to the soil. Shoulders like a cast-iron stove, hands big enough to palm a 5-gallon bucket, and every movement careful enough to thread a needle. I watched those hands pinch bindweed runners one by one, tracing each vine back to its root crown, lifting gently so carrot tops beside it barely trembled. When a tendril snagged a bean stem, the hand paused, repositioned 2 fingers, and unwound it without tearing. The scale and the delicacy in the same frame made my mind stall out. I had no category for it. Gus stood up, stretched, and walked 3 steps closer to the open gate. He sat, just sat, ears forward, calm as old furniture. If there had been danger in that garden, he would have told me first, and loud. Instead, he looked from the figure to me as if asking whether I planned to join the shift. My heartbeat was loud enough I could hear it in my jaw. I wanted to stand and run to the house. I wanted to step through the gate and thank whatever part of the world had done this. I did neither. I stayed where I was, hands open on my knees, and let the moment hold. The figure moved toward the tomato frames and set a pulled mat of vines on the path in a perfect oval, roots all one direction, like someone laying out harness lines. Then it reached to the fence post, touched the top rail where I'd found the crossed stones 2 days earlier, and stilled. It turned its head. Amber-brown eyes met mine through the mist. Not bright like an animal caught in headlights. Steady. Aware. Old in a way I can't put into technical terms. There was no challenge in that look. No warning, no ask. Just recognition, plain and direct, as if we had both arrived at the same gate from opposite sides and agreed to stop there. My mouth worked before my brain caught up. "Morning," I said, barely above a whisper. The figure held still another second, then gave the smallest tilt of its head, almost a nod, and went back to work among Lisa's rows. The figure held that crouch as if my speaking hadn't startled him at all, and that unnerved me less than it steadied me. I had spent weeks bracing for things to break, for every fragile step forward to come with a cost, and here was this huge, rain-dark presence working Lisa's rows with the same patient attention she used to give a stubborn zipper tomato. He moved down the bed, tracing vine to root, separating the choking runners from the stems I wanted to keep. Each pull was deliberate, each placement was deliberate. Even the weed pile grew in a tidy crescent, roots all facing out, like he was making future hauling easier for whoever came after. I stayed in the shed shadow until my knees started to ache, then eased up slow so I didn't scrape the chair. He looked over once, not fixed on me, just checking position, the way two men in a shop keep track of where the other one is when a heavy part is swinging. That was the first moment I felt the fear leave my chest for real. Not all at once, more like a knot coming loose strand by strand. I stepped into clearer light with my hands open at my sides and took 2 paces toward the gate. Gus stayed seated and calm, and the creature's shoulders didn't tighten. He just shifted half a step to give me a clean lane by the fence post. "I'm coming in," I said quietly, because saying my movement out loud felt respectful, and because I didn't know what else counted as manners in that moment. He dipped his head once and turned back to the bed. I walked through the gate like I was entering church late, trying not to make noise. Mud took my boot heels and let go with soft pops. The smell was wet soil and torn vine and cedar drip. Chickadees hopped along the tomato frame 3 feet from his arm, fussing at each other over nothing in particular. That did more for my nerves than any prayer I knew. I knelt at the opposite end of the row and started on a thistle crown, keeping my movements smooth and visible. We worked the same line from opposite sides and met in the middle 20 minutes later, him placing a final handful of bindweed onto the pile, me shaking dirt from my gloves like a man pretending this was an ordinary Tuesday. I actually whispered, "Excuse me," when I had to edge past him with an armful of vine. And if anyone had told me a month earlier I'd be saying "excuse me" to an 8-foot neighbor in my wife's garden, I'd have advised them to drink water and get some sleep. He shifted his weight just enough for me to pass, careful not to crowd me, and I felt foolish and deeply grateful at the same time. Up close, the scale of him made every object around us look toy-sized. Stakes, bucket, my own hands. But the details weren't wild or chaotic. His fur was thick and layered, darker on the shoulders, with lighter brown where morning mist had parted it into lines. His hands were broad, yes, but the fingertips moved with precise control, pinching tiny runners, brushing loose soil back around a bean stem, patting once to settle it. When he reached for a snagged vine near the marigolds, he used 2 fingers and his thumb. No more pressure than I'd use to lift a moth off a window screen. I worked until my lower back sent a warning straight up my spine and into my ribs. I sat back on my heels and breathed through it, head down. By then, the sun had begun to burn the fog off the lower field, and drops fell from cedar tips in a slow, ticking rhythm. I felt him pause beside the next post, waiting without staring. Not impatience, not concern exactly, just room. I raised one hand to show I was fine and managed, just old machinery. He made a soft breath through his nose, almost like a huff of acknowledgement, then moved to the compost corner and lifted a weed mat I'd been dragging in pieces for days. He carried it one-handed and laid it exactly where I'd been trying to build the pile straight. No flourish, no demand for attention, just the work getting done. By late morning, we had reclaimed nearly the whole centre bed. I stood at the gate, sweat cooling under my jacket, and looked over what used to be a green wall. Dark earth showed in clear rows. Carrot tops stood unbroken. The marigold corner was bright again, tiny suns against brown soil. He remained inside the fence a moment longer, checking each line with that same surveyor's patience, then stepped to the post and rested 2 fingers against the latchboard, right where his tracks always stopped outside. Boundary kept. Boundary acknowledged. "Appreciate it," I said, the words rough in my throat. He turned those amber-brown eyes towards me, steady as before, and gave one slow nod. Then he moved back through the mist towards Cedar Shade, not hurried, not hiding, simply done with the morning's part. I stood there long after he vanished between trunks. Gus trotted to the tree line, sniffed where the last print sank deep in wet loam, then came back and leaned his shoulder against my shin. I put my hand on his neck and realized I was smiling without meaning to. It felt rusty. It felt right. By the next dawn, I had stopped trying to trap proof and started trying to keep pace. I still measured what I could. Habit had its place. I logged the new tracks in my notepad, took 2 photos in clear light, and tucked the camera and notes into the kitchen drawer where Lisa used to keep seed catalogues and string. Then I went out and worked. He arrived through the cedars after first light, visible this time before I was ready, and took up the far row while I handled the near one. No ceremony, just shared labor. We fell into a rhythm that felt earned. Pull, shake, stack, check the seedlings, move to the next square. When I needed to cross paths, I said, "Coming through." When he needed the same, he paused until I looked up and stepped aside. Somewhere in there, disbelief stopped being useful. That afternoon, I made myself call Cal while my hands were still muddy, because if I waited for the perfect words, I'd wait another season. He answered on the second ring. "Dad?" "Yeah." My voice cracked and I cleared it. "Hey." Silence, then a breath I could hear. "You okay?" "No," I said, honest for once. "But better than I was. Been working the garden. For real working it." "That's good," he said, careful and plain. "That's real good." We talked 11 minutes about practical things, which is how men like us say bigger things when we're still learning. He told me Eli had decided worms were either farm helpers or spies, depending on the hour. I told him the shed roof patch held through 2 rains. He said, "I can come up this weekend if you want help." I looked out the window toward the fence and saw one large print at the gate from that morning, rain already softening the edges. "Not this weekend," I said. "Soon, though. I'd like that." When we hung up, I sat at the table with the phone in both hands and let the quiet settle around me without feeling punished by it. 2 mornings later, the kindness became undeniable, in a way even my skeptical brain couldn't file under coincidence. I'd been trying to save Lisa's old rose starts along the lower fence, 3 heirloom bushes she'd babied through frost years by draping feed sacks over them at night. The bindweed had wrapped their bases thick as rope, and one of the support hoops had bent flat in winter storms. I'd avoided that corner because it looked like a loss I wasn't ready to confirm. That morning, I carried wire cutters down there and crouched by the first bush, telling myself I'd do what I could and accept the rest. He was already in the garden, working near the beans. When I moved to the rose bed, he watched once, then crossed the path and stopped 6 feet away. I pointed at the twisted mass around the first crown and said, "This part's bad." I touched the bent hoop. "Don't think I can lift that clean with my back." He crouched, palms open where I could see them, and waited. I nodded. What followed was the most careful, heavy work I had ever seen. He slid one hand under the hoop and one under the weed mat, raising both together so no pressure tore the canes. I clipped runners as they came taut, and he held steady, unmoving, while I freed each loop. Mud ran down his forearms. Thorns caught in fur, and he didn't jerk away. When the last bindweed knot came loose, he carried the whole sodden mass to the outside pile and set it down in one piece. Then he returned and used the heel of his hand to press soil back around the rose crown in a firm ring, exactly the way Lisa used to do after transplant shock. I had to stop and wipe my face with my sleeve, though it hadn't started raining. "Hang on," I muttered and went to the shed for stakes and jute twine. When I came back, he stood at the bed edge, waiting for direction like a quiet apprentice who already knew most of the job. I tapped one spot, then the next. Here and here. He placed the stakes with gentle pressure, not pounding, just twisting, until they held. I tied the canes loose in figure eights. He steadied each stem while I worked. We did all 3 bushes that way. When we finished, the rose row looked tended again. Not pretty yet, but possible. Alive enough to answer spring. He stepped back and looked from the roses to me. Then he reached to the fence rail and set something down between us. Lisa's old hand fork, the short one with the cracked walnut handle I hadn't seen since the week after her funeral. Cleaned. Teeth straightened as best they could be. Handle wiped free of rust dust. I picked it up and turned it over in both hands, thumb resting in the groove her thumb had worn. My chest folded in on itself. I bent at the waist and cried into my gloves. Not loud, not dramatic, just years of held breath leaving. Gus came and leaned against my hip until I steadied. When I straightened, he was still there, giving me distance and staying present at the same time, which is rarer than people admit. I swallowed hard and managed. Thank you. He touched 2 fingers to the gate post, the same small gesture as always, then turned toward the cedars. I watched him go until the trees took him. Hand closed around that fork. The rose starts upright behind me and the green choke piled in defeated heaps by the compost corner. For the first time since Lisa died, I did not feel like I was tending ruins. I felt like I was participating in a life still underway. I stood with that hand fork in my palm until the damp wood warmed to my skin, looking at the row of roses and the clean line of earth around them, trying to absorb that this morning had happened in the same world where I had spent 2 years barely answering my own life. The sky above the ridge had gone flat and pewter while we worked, and now wind came down the slope in cool pushes that carried rain smell ahead of rain itself. Gus shook once, hard, and looked toward the shed. I slipped Lisa's fork into my back pocket, flexed my sore fingers, and told the empty path, "I'll finish the rest." By late afternoon, the storm reached us with no drama at first, only a fine slanting drizzle that darkened boards and turned the garden paths slick again. I went after the last heavy bed, the one I had been avoiding because the green choke's main crown sat there like a stubborn knot at the center of a rope, thick white runners diving under the whole square. I cut what I could, pried what I could, and got nowhere useful. The shovel bounced, roots held, rain thickened. I muttered practical nonsense at it, same way I used to talk to seized bolts, and got the same answer from the ground. Then the weather changed for real. In 10 minutes, drizzle became hard rain, and in 5 more it was a cold sheet blowing sideways hard enough to sting my neck. Water started racing down the upper path and cutting straight through the lower beds where Lisa used to plant greens. I ran for the shed, grabbed the stack of old sandbags I kept for spring runoff, and dragged 2 down by the fence one-handed, slipping every other step. The 3rd bag twisted when I tried to swing it into place. A bright pull shot across my lower back and dropped me to one knee in the mud before I could catch the post. I stayed there, breathing against the pain, rain hammering my jacket, watching brown water press at the rose row we had just saved. Hail started mixed in, small hard pellets clicking off the gate and leaves. I remember thinking, not in words exactly, but in that blunt way panic thinks, I can't lose this again. Not this row. Not today. I got one hand on the sandbag and tried to lever up. My back answered with another sharp refusal. Gus barked once from the porch, then once more, not frantic, just announcing. When I looked up, he was already stepping out from the cedar edge. He moved through rain like rain didn't argue with him, full height now, shoulders broad enough to break the weather into 2 streams. He crossed the grass in long, quiet strides, came to the failing lower edge, and took in the whole mess in one sweep. Torn channel, sagging post, roses bending under hail, me half kneeling with mud to my wrists. No hesitation. He braced the leaning post with a fallen limb from the path, wedging it low, then lifted the sandbag I'd dropped and set it square in the gap like it weighed nothing more than feed. Water shifted course at once, not gone but slowed, enough to work with. I got to my feet in stages and hobbled to the centre bed, because that crown still held and every runner still fed it. He joined me there. I pointed through rain, hand shaking from strain. "That one," I said. "Heart of it." He crouched and pushed both hands into the mat, fingers spreading under the roots while I cut surface lines free with my pruning knife. Mud sucked and resisted. He rocked the mass once, twice, then paused so I could clear one last live bean tendril caught underneath. When I nodded, he lifted. The whole crown came up in one sodden, rope-thick body, roots dangling like wet cable. He carried it to the outside of the fence and laid it down beyond the gate, cleanly, as if setting down a finished burden we had both been hauling for months. Hail struck harder then, rattling on the shed roof and bouncing white in the paths. The rose starts took it full on one row over. He turned immediately, stepped between hail and the plants, and lowered himself into a half-crouch so his back and shoulders took the impact while his hands cupped around each stem base. I crawled in beside him with a bucket of loose soil and packed mud around the roots he steadied, one plant at a time. He shifted just enough for me to reach, then covered again when the wind gusted. The size of him was beyond reason. The care in the movement was beyond reason too. That contrast split me open more than anything else. I was crying before I noticed. Rain and tears together, face hot despite the cold. Grief came up from someplace I had been locking with both hands since the hospital, all at once and without dignity. "I kept leaving it," I said to the storm, to Lisa, to the creature kneeling in hail beside me. "I kept leaving all of it." My voice broke. I thought if I touched it, I'd lose her again. He didn't reach for me, didn't crowd me, didn't turn away either. He stayed. He held the stem steady while I packed soil and sobbed into my sleeve like a man finally too tired to pretend strength was silence. For a long stretch, we did only that work: shelter, pack, straighten, tie. My breathing slowed, the hail thinned back to rain. Runoff eased behind the sandbags. I stood bent at the waist with both palms on my thighs, chest shuddering, and he took one final pass through the centre bed, flattening uprooted runners into a single pile beyond the fence, separate from everything still living. When he returned, he had something in his right hand, mud-rinsed and dark with age. He placed it on the flat stone by the gate between us and stepped back. It was Lisa's trowel with the bent ferrule and the brass wedding band she had wired around the handle years earlier as a joke and a promise, because she said garden tools got married to the person who used them right. I had lost it the week of the funeral and searched every drawer, every bin, every coat pocket, like a man convinced one object could keep a whole life from slipping. Now it lay clean. Ring still fixed, scratches exactly where my thumb remembered them. I picked it up with both hands and pressed it to my chest. Whatever wall I had left gave way then. I cried hard and plain in the open rain, not fighting it, not apologizing for it, while Gus pressed against my leg and whined low in his throat. When I could speak again, I looked up. He stood by the gatepost, water running from his fur in steady lines, amber-brown eyes on me with that same calm, no hurry in them. I wiped my face with my sleeve and laughed once through the crying at how strange and true my life had become. I am a full-grown mechanic bawling in a mud hole while a giant helps me save roses, I said. If I heard this from somebody else, I'd check his coffee for moonshine. The laugh turned into another rough breath. But thank you for all of it. Rain softened to a steady patter. The garden looked beaten and alive at the same time. Rose scuffed but standing, roses upright, the green choke's crown outside the fence where it could not feed itself anymore. He glanced once toward the cedar line, then back to me. I understood that look without needing language. Work complete. Boundary respected. I straightened as much as my back allowed, tightened my hand around the trowel, and said the only words that fit what came next. "You can go," I whispered. "I'll keep it from here." He gave one slow nod. Then he touched 2 fingers to the gatepost, exactly where the morning gifts had rested day after day, and turned toward the trees. No final display. No checking whether I watched. He moved through wet grass and mist in that same unhurried gait and entered the cedars until dark fir became shadow, and shadow became distance. Gus took 3 steps after him, stopped at the line and sat down, tail still. He stayed there until the last movement was gone, then came back and stood beside me without being called. I remained at the gate a long time with rain dripping from my hat brim, listening to ordinary sounds return: water from eaves, a jay complaining from the firs, the small clink of hail melting off the metal bucket. In the centre bed where the thick crown had ruled, he had left one quiet arrangement I hadn't noticed in the storm. 3 marigold heads set in a shallow arc with 4 pale river pebbles beside them, bright orange against dark mud like embers banked for later. I crouched as far as my back allowed, touched the nearest pebble, and nodded to the empty cedar line as if he were still there to see it. By dusk, the downpour had passed east and left only low fog in the drawer. I carried the bent trowel and Lisa's fork into the house, washed them carefully at the sink, and set them side by side on the windowsill over the kitchen table. Mud streaked the floor. My jacket dripped on the chair. I did not clean either right away. I stood in that wet quiet, phone in my hand, and called Cal before fear could start its old argument. When he answered, I said, "I had a hard day, and a good one. Garden held. I want you up here when you can come." His silence lasted a beat, then he said, voice thick, "We'll come Sunday, Dad." I looked out toward the darkening fence and the rose we had saved and answered, "I'll have it ready." I set the phone down, kept my hand on it a second, and listened to the kitchen settle around me. The stove ticked as it cooled. Rain dripped from my jacket hem to the plank floor in slow, steady drops. On the sill, Lisa's fork and trowel sat side by side in the fading light, like 2 old workers clocked out after a long shift. I took a clean dish towel, dried both tools again, even though they were already dry, and wrapped the trowel in one of Lisa's soft flour sack cloths before placing it in the top drawer by the seed catalogues. Not hidden. Kept. The fork went in the crock by the sink where we used to keep spatulas and wooden spoons, because it was going back into use. Then I opened the kitchen drawer where I had stored the notepad, tape measurements, and point-and-shoot camera. I read every page, checked each time-stamped photo, and slid all of it into a metal biscuit tin with a lid that snapped tight. I wrote on masking tape across the top, "Garden, April." I did not mail it to anyone. I did not post it. I set the tin on the pantry shelf above the honey Warren brought me, because that was where truths lived in that house now, plain and reachable. By Sunday morning, the sky had cleared hard and bright, with new snow still showing in thin white lines high on the north ridge. I was up before first light, moving slower because my back still argued, but I had coffee on, biscuits mixed, and bacon in the cast iron before 7. I walked the garden twice while the oven warmed, There were no fresh giant tracks in the loam, only the deep ones from the storm day, softened and widened by 2 nights of damp and 1 full day of sun. The arrangement of marigold heads and river pebbles in the centre bed remained exactly where I had left it, untouched by wind, bright as a quiet signal. At the gatepost I found no new gift, no stone cross, no feather, and I felt a brief ache that surprised me with its sharpness. Then I heard tyres on gravel. Cal climbed out first, taller than I remembered, even though that made no sense, and Eli unfolded from the back seat in rain boots too big for him, grinning with his front tooth gap like he had discovered a secret engineering flaw in the universe. Cal stopped by the truck door and looked at me the way a son looks at a father when too much has gone unsaid for too long. "You look tired," he said. "I am tired," I answered. "Come eat." He laughed once through his nose, eyes wet but steady. "You still lead with food when things are serious." "Worked on you for 38 years. At the table, Eli told me in one breath that worms were officially farm helpers now, not spies, and that he had brought his own gloves for professional planting. I listened to him while Cal buttered a biscuit and watched me over the rim of his coffee mug. Halfway through breakfast, Cal set his cup down carefully and said, "Dad, I need one straight answer. When I called all those weeks and you didn't pick up, were you done with us, or were you drowning?" The kitchen went very still. I folded my napkin once and told the truth. "I was drowning," I said, and I was ashamed of it. I heard every voicemail, every one. I didn't answer because hearing you hurt, and I didn't know how to do that without shutting down. I looked at him directly. "I'm sorry." He nodded slowly, jaw tight, then reached across the table and squeezed my forearm once. "I can work with that," he said. "I can't work with silence." "We'll do better than we did," I said. "We will." After breakfast, Eli carried seed garlic in a metal bowl like an offering and marched to the garden in those oversized boots. We knelt in the upper bed where drainage held best, and I showed him how to press each clove point up, 2 knuckles deep, 6 inches apart. Cal ran twine lines between stakes while I checked spacing and tried not to stare too often at how his hands matched mine now, broad-palmed and scarred at the same knuckles. At one point, Eli held up a marigold pebble from the centre bed and asked, "Who made this little circle?" I answered without hesitation. "A friend helped with this garden," I said. "A very quiet friend." Eli considered that and placed the pebble back exactly where it had been. "Then we should leave his art alone." "Agreed," I said. By late afternoon, we had 3 garlic rows in, 2 compost loads spread, and the rose starts tied to fresh stakes. Cal stood by the gate, wiping mud from his hands, and looked at the tracks that still showed as broad depressions near the cedar side. "Those from the storm day?" he asked. "Yeah." He measured one against his boot with his eyes and gave a low whistle. "That's not a normal print." "No," I said. "It isn't." He didn't push for more. He just glanced toward the tree line where Gus sat with his old calm posture, then back at me. "You look different out here," he said quietly. "Lighter." I rested both hands on the gatepost where those 2 fingers had touched so many mornings. "I feel different," I said. Still sad, but not sealed shut. That evening, after Eli fell asleep on the couch under Lisa's patchwork throw, Cal and I sat on the porch with coffee gone lukewarm and watched fog gather in the draw. The ridge held the last gold light for a minute, then let it go. I told him the whole account, plain and chronological, with no performance and no apology. The first tracks at the gate, the untouched flower line, the weed mounds, the crossed stones, the feather, the yarrow, the dawn glimpse, the storm, the roses, the trowel. Cal listened with his elbows on his knees, eyes on the yard, not interrupting except once to ask, You were never scared? I thought about that. I was startled and I was overwhelmed, I said. But I was never in danger. Gus knew it before I did. Cal nodded toward the dog. That old mutt always had better judgment than us. Consistently. He sat with that, then said, I believe you. No drama, no sermon. Just 4 words that settled something in me I hadn't known was still shaking. 3 days later, with my back steadier, I drove to Miller's Feed with a pocket full of hose washers I actually needed this time, and the camera in my jacket. Warren stood by the seed potato bins, arguing friendly prices with Marlene. When he saw me, he gave me that same measured look from weeks earlier, only softer now. Garden still standing? He asked. Standing and planted, I said. Garlic's in. He nodded toward the coffee pot. That's good medicine. I took the point and shoot from my pocket and showed him 2 photos at the counter. One of the gate prints with tape measure, one of the center bed after the storm with the uprooted crown outside the fence. Warren studied both a long moment, then handed the camera back without comment. Marlene glanced over his shoulder, frowned in concentration, and said, My grandmother used to leave apples on her porch rail every first frost. Said thank you to the ridge for getting her through lambing season. She gave a small shrug. People used to know how to accept help without filing paperwork. One of the old men from the Staples aisle was there again. He lifted his cup toward me and said, Told you some of us been helped before. He did not elaborate, and I did not ask him to. Not every thread needs pulling to be real. I won't be reporting it, I said to Warren as we stepped outside. Good, he said. You got what mattered. I looked at the mud on my boots, thought of Cal's hand on my forearm, Eli setting pebbles back in place, the rose starts upright. Yeah, I said. I got what mattered. Summer took hold with warm nights and long evenings, and the garden answered honest work in honest ways. The choke never returned to the center bed. Stray runners showed up at the fence margins where strays always try their luck, but they came up easy now, roots shallow, no deep crown holding court underground. I kept the marigold pebble arrangement undisturbed through the season, and when frost finally blackened the last bean leaves, I moved those pebbles to a shallow wooden tray on the windowsill, beside the cleaned hawk feather, the crossed stones, and a pressed yarrow stem between wax paper. Every collected sign had a place, labelled in pencil on masking tape underneath with date and weather. Same way I tagged parts bins at the shop. Evidence, yes. Also, gratitude. The prints stopped for good after that storm week. I still checked most mornings through June, then, every few days, then once a week when watering ran late and chores piled up. No new tracks. No fresh gifts at the gate. What remained was the boundary itself, respected and meaningful, and the work in front of me. On cool evenings, I would stand with one hand on that post, listening to chickadees settle and coyotes call down the draw, and feel watched sometimes in the gentlest way, like being remembered without being followed. The first Saturday of October, Cal and Eli came up again to pull carrots and stack split cedar for winter. Eli held up a crooked carrot shaped like a bent finger and declared it monster-approved produce. Cal laughed, then caught my eye over the wheelbarrow and smiled in that quiet, adult way that says we made it through something together. After supper, Eli asked if he could put one marigold on the gate for the quiet friend. I let him, and we did it at dusk, all 3 of us. Gus, slower now, stood beside us and leaned against my leg as the light faded. I never got an explanation. I stopped needing one. What changed was not my appetite for mystery, but my capacity to live inside it without bitterness. I answered my son's calls. I slept longer stretches, not every night, but enough to wake clear more mornings than not. I worked fewer hours at the shop when I returned, took Sundays off, and planted by season instead of by mood. When grief came, and it still came, I met it in rows and tasks and shared meals instead of sealed rooms. The world did not get smaller to fit my loss. It got larger around it. Every spring since, I have opened that gate before dawn, looked for tracks, and found only my own boot prints and Gus's, later Eli's, in damp soil. The edge of forest stays tended in a way I cannot attribute to weather alone, and the green choke has never reclaimed the heart of the garden. I keep Lisa's trowel in the drawer, her fork by the sink, and the biscuit tin on the pantry shelf with notes and photos. I chose not to surrender to argument. When people I trust ask what happened on that mountain, I tell them plainly, I was falling apart, and something vast and kind helped me pull weeds until I could carry my life again. Then I hand them a bowl of beans or garlic from that ground, because that is the part you can taste.